net exports, it's net because what we do is we take the value of all the exports, right? Which are stuff that we sell to other countries. And then we subtract off the stuff that we buy from other countries, which are imports, right? So exports are stuff that we sell to other countries. Imports are stuff that we buy from other countries. And it should make sense that, exports should be in our calculation of GDP, because that's really like our fourth entity, right? Consumers, businesses, government, and then the fourth entity then are who? Foreigners, right? And they buy our stuff too. So if we sell stuff to them, that should count to our GDP. Now, why do we subtract off imports? This is kind of interesting. The reason why we subtract off imports is because imports are actually counted in consumption, investment, and government spending. So when we break down C, I, and G, we actually don't care whether it's made in America or not made in America. So iPhones, right, are made in China. So technically not an American product. Not that it really matters, but technically it's a Chinese product. When you buy an iPhone, consumption will show that, that $1,000 iPhone, it makes consumption go up by $1,000. But that shouldn't make sense, right? Because that would make GDP go up by $1,000. But since that thing was made in China, who should really get the credit for that? China, right? So what we do then is to reverse that effect. We then subtract off that $1,000 in imports from net exports. Okay, does that kind of make sense? So that way, so if you buy an iPhone, what'll happen is consumption will go up by $1,000. Net exports will do what? It's on the negative side, right? So it'll go down by $1,000. So the plus 1,000 minus 1,000 will cancel out. And so what will be the net effect on GDP? Nothing, which makes sense, right? Because we shouldn't subtract away from GDP because it's not like we destroyed an iPhone. We also shouldn't add to our GDP because we didn't make it. So if China makes it, their GDP goes up, but ours remains the same, okay? But the different components will change because imports are included in consumption, investment, and government spending. And again, we add up all these four components and then, y is equal to sigma x. Okay, does that make sense about the net exports? All right, so what are the components and how large are they for the overall GDP? This is a little bit old data, but US is mostly a consumption-based economy, which has its pros and cons. But basically, out of the stuff that we make, basically almost like 70% of it is consumed by ourselves. So stuff that we make, we buy it ourselves. This makes us sort of less dependent on other countries. Because we're sort of consumption driven. So we kind of run our own economy. This is a nice healthy number. 16%, it means that's a pretty large number that we're devoting to investment, which means that there'll be good future growth. G, this is probably like average for the world, maybe even a little bit smaller. Some countries are much larger percentages of government spending. Like a France or a Scandinavian country might be like 50% or 60%. The GDP is primarily the government is the one that's producing stuff for the people. And then what does this refer to? Net exports negative means what's got to be true? The imports must be, yeah, and so to make it negative, it's got to be, we're importing more than we're exporting. And this is what's called the trade deficit. This is something that we'll discuss later in the class. Other countries, some countries have very, very large trade surpluses. Like Japan has a very, very large trade surplus. And we'll talk about the reasons for these later. Yeah.
So that means we're importing more than we're exporting.
Yeah. Yeah. Which has its pros and cons. And again, we'll talk about this later in the class. Yeah.
Out of all of them, is that potentially have the biggest impact on our economy?
No, because all these are equally important, right? And they change all the time. So a recession could come from decline in any of these things, like not just this one. This though could potentially be a symptom of a long-term problem for America, and probably is a long-term problem for America. But again, we'll talk about it like in about a month or so. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just curious if there was like a higher GDP, would it like necessarily correspond with like higher waste in like a certain countries because there's so much like products coming out?
Higher what, waste?
Yeah, like say like the United States makes like a lot of like products within like the year for the period of time, would it correspond with like having more waste in that country? Or?
I'm not sure. It doesn't have to. Like for example, like Japan is a great example where that's a they're very, very good about recycling and not being wasteful. And they're still like a super, super high. I mean, it's the third biggest economy in the world. And that's probably just based off of their culture, where American culture is a little bit more wasteful. But I don't think it's a symptom of being rich or not. The culture, the incentives that the country has to be not wasteful. Certainly we're so wealthy that, we could probably afford to not eat our food completely and it's like leave some scraps out there. But if you're in a poor developing country, you're gonna eat every single thing that's out there because you're starving all the time. So in that sense, yeah, there might be more waste for a rich nation. Yeah.
How do we have a positive GDP if we're importing more than?
Well, this negative is just how much exports versus imports, but not the overall GDP. In this case, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are for the exports and imports, but I'm gonna guess that we probably exported we're a pretty big export nation, so we export like $1 or $2 trillion. Okay, so if you think about it, that's still just a fraction of how much we consume even at home, right? And so if let's say that we export $2 trillion, the fact that this is negative just means that we import 2.5 trillion, right? So 2.5 minus the 2 creates the $500 billion deficit. But that negative is not big enough to mean that overall we're not making more stuff, because the vast majority of the stuff we make is bought by ourselves. So Americans are buying our own products. Foreigners are only buying like 2 trillion or $1.5 trillion worth of our stuff. So that's like 1/10 of what Americans buy. Okay. All right. So, this kind of just shows it over time. They change obviously over time. You can kind of see here, this fact that it's up here means it's negative. This trade deficit started in the 1980s. And again, we're going to we'll study why this exact happened later on in the class. Now, here's what you